All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness. And though he had seen many specters in his time, and been more than once beset by Satan in diverse shapes in his lonely perambulations, yet daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in despite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that caused more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. The legend of Sleepy Hollow is a narrative that has endured for centuries and become an inexorable part of American folklore. The spectral horseman and his fiendish pursuit of Ichabod Crane evokes vivid images of moonlit nights and campfire myths. Yet the story is not just a simple ghost tale. It was written to be a reflection of the cultural landscape of early America, a metaphor for the conflict between tradition and radical progress, and a rumination on universal themes that transcend time. Written by Washington Irving, one of the first great American writers, the story blends humor, folklore, and social critique to address questions of identity, ambition, and tension between old-world traditions and the forces of modernity beginning to mold the newly independent nation. Through Ichabod's story, Irving explores the dynamics between the bookish outsider and the self-assured local hero. Through the Horseman, Irving imparts themes of historical memory and the way past events continue to haunt the present. The legend of Sleepy Hollow is a microcosm of 19th century America, a land in flux caught between the old ways and the new. The story is about Ichabod Crane, a timid, credulous schoolteacher who becomes captivated by the beautiful Sleepy Hollow local, Katrina Van Tassel, and finds himself at odds with the town's favorite son, Brom Bones. This love triangle ends in a night of terror as Ichabod encounters the legendary Headless Horseman. The frantic chase ends with Ichabod's mysterious disappearance, leaving the readers in ambiguity over the true nature of the horseman. Was he real? Was he a man playing a frightful prank? Or was he simply a manifestation of the fear permeating Sleepy Hollow? Saddle up, we're about to journey into the mists of Sleepy Hollow, where the Headless Horseman isn't just haunting the town, he's riding through the heart of American folklore. Quick aside to say, if you like this video, please subscribe, and if you really like any of my artwork in the background, it's available for purchase at my shop, afterplagueart.com, or go to the link in the description. Beneath this seemingly simple narrative is a plethora of commentary on American life in the early 19th century. But let's rewind a little bit to the beginning of Irving's story. Washington Irving was born on April 3, 1783, as the youngest of 11 children, though many didn't make it to adulthood. His father, William Irving, was a successful merchant and a Presbyterian deacon. Washington was an adventurous boy, and so he struggled deeply with the strict religious upbringing his father demanded. In 1807, Washington and two of his brothers, William Jr. and Ebenezer, began writing a magazine that satirized the New England Puritans and the Dutch governor under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickenbocker, a name that might be familiar to any Sleepy Hollow scholar. This was Irving's first written work, and over the next 2 years he became more well known for The History of New York, another satirical work. In 1820, Irving finished what would become his most famous book, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. It was a series of short stories based on older European folklore, and it contained two of his most well-known, Rip Van Winkle, a story about a man who slept through the Revolutionary War, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Irving was burgeoning as a writer as Romanticism, with a capital R, was on the rise, and the movement strongly influenced the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. Alongside that movement was a rise in Gothic literature. Hume clarifies the distinction in his article Gothic versus Romantic. Gothic writing is closely related to Romantic. Both are the product of a profound reaction against everyday reality and conventional religious explanations of existence. But while Romantic writing is the product of faith in an ultimate order, Gothic writing is a gloomy exploration of the limitations of man. Gothic literature emerged in the late 1700s in response to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment movement posited that everything in our world had to have a logical, rational explanation. Philosophers of this era valued scientific thinking and knowledge as a goal. Romantic, and more accurately Gothic, writers wanted to evoke an emotional response in their audience by including foreign places, the supernatural, irrational behaviors, uncertainty, and even anachronisms. Irving excelled in the descriptive writing style that was typical of Gothic literature, but he truly became a romantic after the death of his fiancée, Matilda Hoffman, in 1809. He harbored a certain melancholy about love and death after that trauma, and author Kruk agrees that the theme of unattainable love surfaces in the love triangle between Ichabod Crane, Katrina Van Tassel, and Brom Bones. Irving as a writer was never hesitant to take inspiration from the world around him. In an article about the popularity of the legend of Sleepy Hollow in the field of adaptation, author Nina Stular writes, "His driving force was not the desire to educate or introduce new reforms, but his enthusiasm for observing people and their manners in everyday moments and portraying them with all their follies and foibles." Therefore, the key to his success was the skill in making pictures pulsing with life's energy, and the talent for showing life as it is, not as it ought to be. The setting for Sleepy Hollow was heavily inspired by one of his travels as a teenager. In 1798, Irving was living in Manhattan, but then a massive epidemic of yellow fever began to sweep through the city. To avoid the deadly illness, Irving was sent away to Tarrytown to stay with a friend, and while he was there, he soaked in the village like a sponge. He wanted to know everything about the Dutch culture, especially all of the local ghost stories. Irving wrote about the residents. Villagers spoke in hushed whispers of the strange cries heard in the woods where the captured British spy John Andre had been hanged. Dutch settlers had been in the area for nearly 200 years at that time, and they were deeply connected to their own folklore and superstitions. The eastern seaboard of the United States was primarily settled by the Dutch and English, and New York in particular became a shared settlement. The cultures and attitudes didn't always blend harmoniously, and we have an example with Ichabod representing a man of English stock moving into a community of Dutch stock settlers. The small-town ghost stories and Dutch culture made a strong impression on Irving, and when he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the vivid landscapes, delicious food, and salacious gossip sank their roots into the foundation of the iconic narrative. Additionally, Irving imbued the Horseman, the characters, and the town of Sleepy Hollow with the early 19th century cultural and political landscape of early America. The Revolutionary War was still close in the nation's memory, and America, as a very young nation, was still struggling to establish a national identity as a distinct, unified nation. The American landscape was populated with lingering remnants of European colonial influences. As well, at the time, Americans were still living under the literary dominance of England, with very little culture of their own to compete. There were no monuments, no works of art, no traditions, and no institutions. No previous American book had achieved popular and critical success before Irving. Much of American literature at the time was heavily influenced by European sensibilities, but Irving, who had lived in both America and Europe, sought to create a distinct American style of storytelling. He didn't shy away from America's European roots, integrating European folklore, but viewing them through the lens of the American experience. Before the release of The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Europeans viewed Americans as intellectually backwards and incapable of creating any great art because they were too practical, and many Americans agreed. However, Irving was able to break through all the doubt and criticism, proving to both Europeans and Americans the possibility of American literature. This tension between old European traditions and the emerging American identity can be personified by the two legs of the love triangle. Ichabod Crane is the personification of European intellectualism. In an analysis of Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Nasrullah Mambrol writes, "One reading is that Ichabod, with his awkwardness and overstimulated imagination, could not fit into the mold of the American male, lacking in the right qualities. He is bested by Brom Bones and fails to capture the woman of his dreams." Ichabod is an outsider to the town of Sleepy Hollow. His role as the school teacher positions him as somewhat separate from the traditional rural folk around him, even though he is technically a member of the community. Ichabod represents the intellectual elite that sees education and reason as a way to achieve social mobility and advancement. He plans to rise above his modest beginnings by marrying the wealthy Katrina Van Tassel, using his mind and manners along the way to impress her and her family. However, despite his analytical approach to life, Ichabod fails to fully understand the values of the community that surrounds him. His belief in the supernatural and his tendency to indulge the ghost stories of Sleepy Hollow told to him by the older women of the town also marks him as separate from those around him. Even though all of the citizens of Sleepy Hollow are aware of their ghostly folklore, they seem unaffected by the same fear that courses through Ichabod and infects his rationality. Even his appearance sets him apart from the community, with his gangly frame and awkward mannerisms causing him to stand out. He is a man who is very much out of step with the reality around him. Despite being the protagonist of Irving's story, Ichabod is not a good man. In her article about Sleepy Hollow adaptations, Stular describes Ichabod as loose-jointed, floppy, fawning, scheming, selfish, conceited, cowardly, speculative, ambitious, capitalist, gullible, sly, greedy, and vain, which Damn. Roasted. He's an individualist and a loner who doesn't appreciate the small-town ethos of Sleepy Hollow and threatens to bring chaos to change the community. There's a really fascinating paper by Sabri Nassar called Humanity, Nature, and the Supernatural in Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This paper discusses the legend of Sleepy Hollow from an ecological lens, and it has some surprising insights about the character of Ichabod. The author argues that Ichabod Crane represents the idea of capitalism in conflict with the family farming community-oriented Sleepy Hollow. He wants to marry Katrina Van Tassel, but his desire doesn't stem from a place of romance or even lust for Katrina. Instead, when Ichabod pictures his life with Katrina, after the inheritance of the Van Tassel estate, he imagines dividing the land into parcels to be sold. He imagines packing Katrina into a wagon with their children and leaving her hometown of Sleepy Hollow as a rich man, thanks to her father's land. If you read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, one of the most notable aspects is Ichabod's insatiable appetite, especially for the culinary delights made from the farms and nature of the village. This is a metaphor for his unquenchable greed to consume Sleepy Hollow, not live within it. Nasser sums it up eloquently. In his imagination, he conceives of nature as a rich and savory banquet, rather than a landscape and scenery. Ichabod has no respect for Sleepy Hollow, and Manasseh presents the argument that the Horseman is a manifestation of nature's anger against the intruder. In its battle against this interloper, the supernatural appears to be nature's most formidable means of putting an end to his obsession with wealth and material abundance. More specifically, nature seeks to drive him away from Sleepy Hollow by arousing his fear of the supernatural and making him believe that the valley is full of weird and uncanny events. They posit that Ichabod is a symbol representing the rise of a culture that values consumption above all else, and in doing so, he greatly endangers the peace, stability, and tranquility of Sleepy Hollow. Another way to interpret Ichabod Crane is through the lens of identity. In many ways, he embodies the American dream, that one can rise to greatness through education and hard work. However, his romantic failure and punishment by the narrative suggests a critique of that very ideal. The underlying message is good. One can rise through knowledge, but Ichabod allowed himself to be corrupted by his greed, and in doing so, he made himself unable to overcome the forces of tradition and sincerity represented by Brom Bones. The rivalry between Ichabod and Brom Bones is representative of the larger social shift taking place in America during this period. The rough, physical masculinity of Brom became more of a central pillar of American culture, along with independence, and that ultimately triumphs over Ichabod's academia. The conflict suggests a tension in the early American national character, a struggle between the old intellectual order and the frontier spirit. But what really happened to Ichabod Crane? The ghostly Headless Horseman chased down the unfortunate schoolteacher, but did you know that Ichabod's body was never found? In one part of the road leading to the church was found the trampled saddle. The tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road and evidently at furious speed were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. Was Ichabod killed by the spectre, or was he frightened so badly he left Sleepy Hollow, never to return? His horse was found grazing, but no sign of the schoolteacher, and Irving suggests Ichabod may have run back to New York and become a judge, a profession Irving had very little respect for. Regardless of what really happened, Ichabod's own belief in ghost stories made him vulnerable to being so frightened, possibly to death. Ichabod's downfall may reflect the anxieties of the time, an outsider who does not belong in a community that values tradition and physical prowess over bookish knowledge. In contrast to Ichabod, Brom Bones is the quintessential local hero, a rugged, masculine figure who is self-assured, physically powerful, and deeply connected to the traditions of the community. In many ways, he is the personification of that American frontier spirit, one that values strength, resilience, and an untamed nature. He doesn't rely on his education or any formal social structures to gain power, though he is very popular with the people of Sleepy Hollow. Many adaptations take Brom's character in a strange direction. They want to simplify the dynamic to that of the timid nerd and the dumb jock. But Brom is a cunning strategist, particularly in his role in orchestrating the terrifying encounter with the Headless Horseman, which serves to ultimately rid the town of Ichabod. His strength was seen as a very desirable trait in the new America, a country that was breaking free from European models of social hierarchy and developing its own identity in a post-revolutionary era. Additionally, Brom has a certain rough-around-the-edges chivalry towards the women of Sleepy Hollow, including Katrina. As Ichabod's love rival for Katrina, Brom couldn't be more different from the gangly, sophisticated schoolteacher. He's characterized as a bit of a country bumpkin, but he has his own skills that make him important and impressive to his community. Brom is a very knowledgeable and skilled horseman, and he rides a beast of a horse named Daredevil. He plays pranks, but the villagers know it's all in good fun, especially because Brom is always willing to help those around him. Brom also displays genuine feelings towards Katrina, in contrast to Ichabod, who is driven only by his greed. When Katrina dances with Ichabod at a party, Brom is described as feeling jealousy, but also love. In Nina Stular's article, she writes, Brom's attraction to Katrina is entirely natural in the form of authentic devotion, whereas Ichabod is, in Hoffman's opinion, a sterile intellectual, who is devoid of the natural human affections, capable only of the emotions of fear and ambition. Ichabod's heart is thus set only on material gain, and he construes the relationship to Katrina primarily in economic terms. If you believe that Brom is the Headless Horseman in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, then he handily defeats Ichabod Crane for Katrina's affection. He manages to scare off the interloper in their community and marry Katrina, laughing whenever he hears the story of Ichabod's wild chase. That fascinating article about ecology notes as well that utilizing the pumpkin to do so is nature's retaliation against the threat. On the most superficial level, Brom Bones defeats Crane by appealing to his superstitious nature and creating a Headless Horseman. On the most important level, however, Bones transforms a harmless item from nature, a pumpkin, into a weapon to arouse a fear of the supernatural in the man who wants to commit an unnatural act, a man whose lust for wealth is explicitly defined as a lecherous and gluttonous assault on the natural. In an article by M. Grant Kellermay, Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Historical Backgrounds and a Deep Literary Analysis, the author reflects on the symbolism of a ghost being the weapon to drive Ichabod away. Ghosts represent culture, community, and fellowship. Imagine sitting around a campfire, telling ghost stories, scaring others, and being scared in a collective emotional release. You're allowing yourself to feel vulnerable around others in a safe way, and in doing so, engaging in a social ritual meant to strengthen communities through shared narratives. This is Brom's ultimate tool against an outsider who doesn't value that community. Katrina Van Tassel is considered by some a proto-feminist heroine. She's described as extremely beautiful, but also intellectual and wily. In the article by Kellermay, the author describes the archetypical gender roles in Sleepy Hollow. 2 local agents are responsible for Sleepy Hollow's fate and serve as exemplars of their respective genders: Brom and Katrina. Brom represents Sleepy Hollow masculinity, easygoing and sincere, yet chivalric and rustic, while Katrina represents Sleepy Hollow femininity, self-aware and empowered, yet watchful and coy. Within the narrative, Katrina seems to be interested in Ichabod, entertaining his romantic pursuits disguised as singing lessons. However, on the night of the dance, she appears to spurn his affections. Irving never describes exactly what is said in this conversation, only that Ichabod leaves it despondent. One interpretation the reader can consider is that Katrina entertained Ichabod's affections simply to attract the attention of Brom Bones and stir him to action through jealousy. Katrina is able to gain control of her courtship in a time when women had very little power by using her intelligence and intuition. Kellermay puts it well once again. Her ultimate choice is made in her best interest. Remember that Ichabod's fantasy involved Katrina serving him food with as much emotional connection between them as a waitress/customer or servant/master. Though the characters play their important roles to perfection, the figure of the Headless Horseman is undoubtedly the most iconic element in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It might be the only element of the story that some people know. Within the context of the short story, the Headless Horseman is not only a symbol of fear, but also the weight of history and the enduring presence of unresolved conflict, although the true history and nature of the Horseman are left unclear, adding to the intrigue. Irving introduces the Horseman as a Hessian soldier who lost his head to a cannonball at the Battle of White Plains during the Revolutionary War, and now roams the earth looking for his missing head. Hessia was a state in Germany, known for its extremely well-trained army, and Hessians were German mercenaries that fought on behalf of the British during the American Revolution. These soldiers were trained from a very young age, and were compensated for their services. They were equipped to fight both on foot and on horseback, and they were extremely skilled trackers, riders, and sharpshooters. The prince of the state, Prince Landgraf Friedrich II of Hessia, would rent his soldiers out to foreign governments. So Americans of the time would have an ingrained fear of Hessian soldiers, making the Headless Horseman an even more terrifying figure at the time. In grounding the mythology in American traditions and history, Irving made strides into creating the first American ghost story. Professor Lewis Grossman explains, Irving intentionally constructed it as a folklore rooted in the country's history and traditions. Thus, it serves not only as a wonderfully written tale, but also particularly through the immortal characters of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman as part of American popular culture and legend. The Horseman is not just a random ghost, he's representative of national memory. His ties to the violent and tumultuous history of the Revolutionary War seal within him an inability to find peace. He's stuck in the past, eternally wandering the earth in search of something he lost, whether that's his head or his place in the world. When there's peace, what good is a mercenary soldier? While the war itself was over, the psychological scars it left behind endured. In the early years of American history, there was still a palpable sense of unrest, and the lingering consequences of the war were visible in all aspects of new American life. The Horseman, then, can be seen as a manifestation of these societal conflicts. The past refused to stay buried in both a metaphorical and a very literal way. In Sleepy Hollow, the past is always close at hand, and the supernatural symbol of unresolved trauma continues to affect those who live in the present. His pursuit of Ichabod reflects how history cannot be outrun or forgotten. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Horseman's role in the narrative is his ability to utilize fear to control the actions of the people of Sleepy Hollow. Ichabod Crane is an intellectual man, but under pressure from fear, particularly fear of the unknown, his irrational terror consumes his rational mind. It's never fully confirmed if the Horseman is truly a haunting ghost or a prank orchestrated by Brom Bones, but regardless, Ichabod's belief in the legend, his vulnerability to superstition, his fear of the unknown ultimately leads to his disappearance. As discussed, Ichabod is an outsider to Sleepy Hollow. Superficially, he attempts to fit in with the community, but all of his actions are truly self-serving. In this sense, it's possible that the Horseman is a tool of social control, an enforcer of the norms and traditions of the Sleepy Hollow community. Whether real or not, the Horseman can be used as a lesson by the community that breaking away from traditional values and threatening the village with destruction will have consequences, especially for those who do not understand the deep cultural and social ties the people of Sleepy Hollow have with each other and the land. We can think of the Horseman as a guardian of the old ways, a protector of tradition who keeps outsiders like Ichabod Crane in check. Ichabod was welcomed into the town until his ambitions to marry into the wealthy Van Tassel family and sell away their land. This was challenged by the embodiment of the town's culture and values, Brom Bones. Through Brom, the Horseman takes a form that enforces the established order and keeps the old world intact in the face of new influences. At the heart of the legend of Sleepy Hollow is the power that folklore has on the collective consciousness. Sleepy Hollow itself is depicted as a liminal space, a space that exists between reality and legend, where the supernatural feels just as real as the physical world. The Horseman is a representation of the stories and myths the community share amongst themselves and pass down through generations. These stories take on a life of their own, shaping perceptions, actions, and decisions. Whether or not the Horseman is a physical entity, his ability to instill fear and shape events shows how powerful folklore can be in creating a sense of reality that is as tangible as any material force. It becomes especially interesting then, if we consider how this story became one of America's first ghosts and folktales. Irving clearly understood what resonated with people culturally, and was able to effectively utilize that to create the Headless Horseman. So, is the Horseman real? It's one of the most central mysteries in the legend of Sleepy Hollow. The story leaves the answer deliberately unresolved, and that's part of why the short story is so compelling to discuss and analyze. The supernatural is always teetering on the edge of possibility, but never fully confirmed. The ambiguity around the Horseman's identity plays into the narrative's larger themes about the power of belief. The power of folklore, superstition, and myth are not to be underestimated. If you'd like my opinion, the Horseman, as a ghost, is not real. At the end of the story, Ichabod's hat is found next to a smashed pumpkin, but the school teacher is never seen again. Occasionally, the story is retold around Brom Bones, and he laughs heartily whenever the pumpkin is mentioned. One additional point of evidence is that of the Hessian's horse. The descriptions of the horse in Brom's tall tale about his encounter with the ghost is vague. Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow, but just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. Daredevil is Brom's horse. He's described as bold, fearless, and a little sinister, and Brom's riding style is reckless and wild. When Ichabod encounters the Horseman, his steed is described as follows. The spectre rode upon a black horse of powerful frame and immense size. He was in no wise particular as to the road he took, but went over bush and brake, over hill and swamp, as straight as a bird flies. So while the story never confirms it outright, there is quite a bit of evidence linking Brom to the Horseman. I think there may have been a vengeful spirit in Sleepy Hollow that night, but it was Brom Bones. The spectral figure in the legend of Sleepy Hollow isn't a unique creation. While the Headless Horseman was one of the first pieces of white American folklore, other headless riders had been terrifying people across Europe since medieval times. Across various cultures, myths, and legends, thunderous hooves carry with them death, vengeance, and the lingering specter of the past. These shared motifs prove that the terror and symbolism of a headless rider isn't solely an American construct, but is instead a deeply rooted archetype in folklore that sparks fears of death, the unknown, and the haunting of unresolved historical grievances. One such creature was the Dullahan. In Irish folklore, the Dullahan is a terrifying creature. He's often described as a headless rider on a midnight black horse, carrying his decaying head under one arm and a whip made of a human spine in the other. The face is moldering, having the color and consistency of rotten cheese, with eyes that constantly move, searching for his next victim, and a permanent grin. Sometimes he's described as simply a rider, but in other tales he drives a truly horrifying wagon called a coach-a-bower, or a death coach. The wagon is made from human skin, adorned with the victim's skulls and using femurs as wheel spokes. 6 massive black horses pull the carriage, and their thunderous hooves are a warning to shut the doors and windows tight, or else the Dullahan might throw blood in the eyes of those who look, blinding them. The Dullahan is an omen of death, and his appearance foretells the death of a member in the community. The demonic creature will call the name of the person marked for death, drawing their soul from their body and killing them instantly. However, some legends say that gold, even a very small amount, might protect you from the Dullahan's wrath. It's easy to make a connection to the Dullahan as an embodiment of death's inevitability, a relentless force that cannot be outrun, with no warning or escape. While the Headless Horseman in the legend of Sleepy Hollow is a manifestation of vengeance and a reflection of America's Revolutionary War, the Dullahan is more about death on an individual level. Another interesting tale is that of the Wild Hunt. Originating in both German and Scandinavian folklore, the Wild Hunt refers to not one rider, but instead a ghostly cohort led by a headless figure. These riders thunder across the night sky with incredible speed on pitch-black horses in pursuit of their unfinished business. In some versions of the myth, the Wild Hunt is a procession of fallen Norse warriors, led by Odin, the chief of the Nordic gods. The pack of hunters is a force that seeks out living people who have committed crimes or are marked for death by fate and dispatching them. Just as Irving's horseman rides at full gallop through Sleepy Hollow, the Wild Hunt seems invincible and relentless in their pursuit of souls. In some folklore, the riders are unable to be seen or heard by the living, except for the sounds of their horses' hooves echoing across the land. The symbolism of the Wild Hunt, death chasing the living, shares clear similarities with Irving's portrayal of the Headless Horseman. The Wild Hunt serves as an omen that foreshadows disasters, usually on a grander scale than individual. These sightings are often linked to seasonal changes of life and death, like when a harsh winter comes and kills all it's able. They represent the uncontrollable forces of fate and mortality. This myth speaks more broadly to a universal fear of the unknown and the inevitable passage from life to death. There's another German myth as well, of headless horsemen on a quest for penitence. They were revenants, which are deceased bodies risen from the dead to haunt the living. These ghosts were doomed to wander the living world until they atoned for their sins by doing kind deeds for strangers. The horseman had the ability to kill the living with a single touch, so when a kind deed was completed, instead of shaking hands, both parties would grab either end of a tree branch, so the branch would wither and die instead of the living person. Some origin stories are more specific about the exact identity behind the ghost. For example, the Scottish legend provides a great many details for their version of the tale. In the 1500s, Ewan of the MacLeans of Loch Buie was moving his army against his father's and a branch of Clan Gillian. Ewan was not very successful, losing his head in battle, but staying astride his horse. The steed returned to his home, but Ewan's body was still twitching. Obviously, this terrified everyone, and they decided that the horse had to be the source of this evil. They decapitated the horse and buried Ewan. Unfortunately for them, the spirits of Ewan and his horse did not rest in peace, and they still ride around the Highlands, both headless. This is another myth where the sight of the Headless Horseman, or in this case the Headless Horse, Headless Man, is a harbinger of death. In southern Texas, there's a ghost known as El Muerto, a rider who dangles his severed head from his saddle while he rides. His horse rides so hard and so quick that his hooves produce lightning when they hit the ground. There's speculation that this version of the Horseman was a horse thief who was captured and beheaded for his crimes. He was made into an example, having his decapitated body tied to a wild horse, his head tied to the pommel of the saddle, and released to wander the world. Clearly, the idea of a headless rider resonates across culture, but why? Across various traditions, the figure of the headless rider consistently represents unfinished business, whether it's vengeance or justice. They remind us that life is fragile and fleeting. The motif of a headless horseman suggests a decoupling of the self, the absence of a head symbolizing the loss of identity. The headless rider could be anyone, a friend, a brother, a neighbor, so it allows a person to identify not only with the terror, but the loss as well. The loss of a head or a face can also distance the creature from the world of the living. It dehumanizes the ghost, and contrarily disallows parts of socialization that human beings crave. Eye contact or a smile goes a long way in communicating our intentions, but without those cues, the headless horseman becomes more of a variable. The lack of observable emotions makes the horseman seem much more like an inevitable force of nature, rather than your typical ghost, a metaphor for a world beyond human control, where death, fate, and the supernatural are always lurking in the shadows. Did you know that the legend of Sleepy Hollow was based on a true story? Well, only kind of based, and only potentially true. There are several elements that can be traced to the real life of Washington Irving. Ichabod Crane was actually a real person, but his similarity is in name only. Irving saw his name in a newspaper and loved it so much he had to name a character after him. The real Ichabod Crane was a soldier in the War of 1812, and though he was alive at the same time as Irving, the two never met. Crane was a lifelong military man and served for nearly his entire life, 45 years. He also wasn't pleased with Irving using his real name in the story, and with how his character is portrayed. The real Ichabod Crane wasn't superstitious, and he was way more likely to fight than flee. Brom Bones was also inspired by a real man. Abraham Martling, nicknamed Brom. There isn't very much information about him floating around, but he was a blacksmith, so likely a pretty huge guy. He also rode a massive black horse, similar to Daredevil, and the horseman's steed in the legend of Sleepy Hollow. The Van Tassels were a real family as well. Irving's sister boarded with them, though they were not the wealthy family of the legend. The Van Tassel family had a young, beautiful daughter named Eleanor, who is very likely the inspiration for Katrina, though her name probably came from Eleanor's aunt, Katrina. Fascinatingly, there's a chance that the Van Tassel family had a connection to the Hessian soldier that would become the legend. There were small militias that cropped up across the colonies during the Revolutionary War, both on the side of the Patriots and Loyalists, and they clashed dozens of times in brutal skirmishes. There was even one full-scale battle, the Battle of White Plains. In times of chaos, those looking to make a quick dollar will always emerge from the woodwork. Two groups of bandits emerged, the Skinners, who were Patriot-aligned, and the Cowboys, who were British-aligned. Tarrytown, the real-life Sleepy Hollow, was raided by the British more than once. In 1777, a raid was conducted on the Van Tassel farm by a party of Hessians and Loyalists. Two of the Van Tassel brothers were captured, their house was burned to the ground, and their horses and cattle were stolen. Elizabeth Van Tassel panicked when her baby daughter Leah was nowhere to be found while their home blazed. It turned out one of the Hessian soldiers had taken her into the shed, wrapped in a warm blanket to ward off the brutal cold. Local legend claims that one morning after this event, the headless corpse of a Hessian soldier was discovered on Albany Post Road, and remembering the kindness of the German who had saved her and her child, Elizabeth Van Tassel arranged for the stranger to be properly buried in a Dutch cemetery. It's likely an untrue story, but it's a good one. The frantic chase through the woods may have even been inspired by real events. There used to be a North American folk custom called a charivari, where members of the community came together to shame another community member. These were most often a kind of mock parade, but they could also be small pranks to not so kindly encourage one to change their behavior. Jesse Merwin, a possible inspiration for Ichabod's personality, was subjected to one of these pranks to force him to finally commit to his fiancée, Jane Van Dyke, and marry her. Mutual friends were bothered by him dragging his feet, so they designed a charivari to frighten him into finally marrying. One night, after leaving Jane's house, Merwin discovered he was being followed by a cloaked horseman. The stalking escalated into a full-fledged chase, ending when the specter disappeared into the woods with a familiar laugh. Merwin took the hint, and quickly thereafter married Jane. Why do we continue to return to Sleepy Hollow? Why is it adapted over and over, and how does it remain relevant in public memory? Part of the reason, a lighter reason, is actually pure luck on Irving's behalf. Halloween. When you picture the Headless Horseman, do you picture a flaming jack-o'-lantern carved with a macabre grin? It wouldn't be out of the norm. If you're actually watching this video instead of doing your homework in the background, you'll notice that I definitely include that imagery in a few of my Sleepy Hollow themed pieces. However, the legend of Sleepy Hollow is set nearly 20 years before pumpkins began being carved into jack-o'-lanterns. Before this, turnips were generally carved into frightening faces by the Irish to ward off evil spirits. The pumpkin, to Irving, was a symbol of something entirely different. Yankees, a derisive term the Dutch made up for English colonists, were sometimes referred to as pumpkin eaters, so Brom's use of this particular gourd would have been an insult on top of injury. The story is also set in the middle of a jolly autumn, and with these aesthetics combined, it has become a Halloween staple. The legend of Sleepy Hollow's endurance also speaks to the power of folklore. Each retelling and adaptations reshapes it to fit the cultural fears and artistic styles of the time. Irving's tale provides a vehicle for exploring complex ideas about fear, power, identity, and memory. The central figure of the Headless Horseman, a supernatural force that chases the living, symbolized many of the universal fears that humans have faced throughout history: fears of death, fate, the unknown, and the consequences of the past. The image of the Headless Rider is a common thread that runs through different cultures and societies, resonating with people in ways that reveal our shared fears of mortality. The Headless Horseman can be interpreted as a metaphor for cycles of violence, vengeance, and unresolved societal conflicts that continue to echo through time. Sleepy Hollow is a reminder that some legends, just like the Headless Horseman, never die. They continue to ride through our collective consciousness, offering warnings, lessons, and revelations about the nature of life, death, and the deep, unbreakable bond between the past and present. The Horseman is a vivid representation of how the ghosts of history do not simply vanish when we move on from them. They chase us, appearing in our myths, in our nightmares, and in our stories. Thank you so much for watching my video about the legend of Sleepy Hollow. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, don't forget to leave this video a like, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and follow me on all my other social media. I am After Plague pretty much everywhere. That's Instagram, that's Threads, that's Blue Sky, that's TikTok, that's Goodreads, and I am After_Plague on Twitter. All of these illustrations that I've completed here today in this video are available on my store, afterplagueart.com, or you can go find it in the link in the description. If you do end up picking up a piece of art, be sure to post on social media and tag me, and I'll give you a little shout out here, on my videos, on my socials, wherever you would like. Thank you again so much for watching, and I hope you are not being chased by Headless Horsemen in this post-plague world. Bye!